Hi there. Welcome to this next month's installment of our church's scripture/Bible studies. We're going to pick up with one of the readings from the lectionary this week, which is the story of Jacob at the Jabbok. Whether we call that Jacob wrestling with a deity or an angel, or the attack at the Jabbok. We'll get to that in a second. But I just want to pick up from where we left off the last time we were together. We were talking about Abraham and Isaac. And we had a character that was very, very obedient, Abraham. Maybe that's the best thing we could say about him, even to the extent of not really thinking about the consequences of his actions very well. And it's a legitimate question to ask whether God prefers blind obedience, or whether blind obedience can go too far. And instead, today we're talking about a character named Jacob, who is Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son. And certainly obedience is not something anyone would ever accuse Jacob of. This painting we've got in the background is a small section of the painting that you can go and see in Paris by Eugene Delacroix, Jacob Wrestling with the Angel. So already that name of the title of the painting gives some indication of how this artist conceives of this. And I'd encourage you to go and check it out. Thank you, Grace Chong, for suggesting this. Okay, let's get right into this. So just to reorient ourselves in terms of the timeline, we're talking about a period of time somewhere in terms of historic events that we can corroborate with other Near Eastern texts and archaeology. We're talking about a time right around the end of the second millennia BCE, so 1250 to 1000 BCE. It's notable to say that because the biblical text itself would have you believe, according to its internal timeline, that it was something much older, around 2000, 2100 BCE. It's about 1,000 years older than we actually know that this happened. There are several inconsistencies that show us that it's probably not around 2100. And some of them are actually pretty interesting. They're wrong names for places that are just wouldn't exist at that time. For example, Ur of the Chaldeans, a city that is supposed to be the origin of Abraham, isn't really called Ur of the Chaldeans until the 7th century BCE. So that would be hard to place at 2100. But we think that name was put in later on into the text. Things like camels weren't domesticated until much later, so they couldn't really be traveling by camel before camels were domesticated by 1,000 years. These kinds of things. One thing that it's important to note, this isn't history. We're talking about a period of legendary ahistorical figures. It's important to note their personality. We can learn moral lessons from them. We can look at them as characters, and they can explain things to us, like what are the origin of different customs or names or phenomena, but we shouldn't take it to mean that these are exactly history. They're true, but they're not fact. And that's an interesting distinction to make and really important for us. Okay, so if we looked at a map of where we're talking about this kind of rough area. It's kind of a bad idea to draw borders, really strict borders, because we're not really sure. But we're talking about a time period in which patriarchs are the important characters, are really the characters are written about. Of course, the other people are important as well, but people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You might add to that list Joseph and Moses as well. They have some patriarchal characteristics and some prophetic characteristics as well. But what was noted is that it's a really neat story, like neat as in like not messy. That there is this lineage of sons, and then boom, in the third generation or fourth generation, it leads to the 12 different tribes of Israel. It's unlikely that actually happened historically. It was noted in the early 20th century that each of these patriarchs had a geographic association. So, for example, Abraham was located with events that occurred to the south of Jerusalem, closer to Hebron. Isaac was located was associated with events that happened even farther to the south in Beersheba. Jacob seems his life, even though there's a lot of wandering in it, moving around, that Haran is mentioned, but more importantly for Israel, up here to the north of Jerusalem, we see Jacob being associated with Bethel, Shechem, and what is called the Central Hill Country. So up here between Manasseh and Ephraim. And that's important because from this observation, one of the thinking about how this text is the product of the development of a society, it was sort of postulated that these different patriarchs represent different local traditions that were later put together into a family tree of genealogy to explain how these different peoples that all had a strong tribal identity that was more local than national, how they could both have a tribal identity that was very, very localized, as well as have a national identity because they're all, as a tribes that are all descended from brothers, they're all related to each other. So it kind of explained how they could be one people and yet understand, without that conflicting with their idea of themselves as being different peoples within one people. So this genealogy, putting together these local heroes, maybe Abraham was more recognized in the areas that are associated with him down in the south, Isaac farther to the south, and then arranging them all into one family tree was a way of being able to capture the truth of their local attraction, but also to still make them related. So to give the people of Israel one unified national identity. It's a pretty interesting theory. I think it's actually pretty, it conforms to the information that we have. And it also helps to explain some things that are problematic if we took the biblical narrative literally, or rather historically. For example, we're told in the biblical narrative that Abraham and his descendants are foreigners, that they come to Canaan from Mesopotamia by way of Syria, and that they settle and then become this flourishing culture. If we had seen that, if that was actually true, we would expect to see in the archaeological record a big difference pretty quickly in material culture. So the artifacts that are left behind, the types of pottery, the types of art, the types of construction of buildings, all of that would have shifted because a new culture bringing in foreign ideas, foreign art would have come into this area. We don't see that, though. There isn't any shift in the archaeological record. So it more strongly suggests that Abraham and his descendants, what would become Israel, were actually local Canaanites that differentiated themselves, that became different because of a belief about themselves, a belief in God, but that they hadn't actually moved anywhere. They still had a lot of features of the local culture. So if you're telling yourself that you're different than your surrounding neighbors who you really came out of, then it's important to be able to tell a story about yourselves that emphasizes that difference, so that you draw a border around the people that are like you and you connect yourself to them. At the same time, you draw a boundary that shows how you are like the people that are, you're claiming to be your relatives, but at the same time that you're different from the people that are outside of your borders. So Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, for example. And that can help to explain why you shouldn't marry them, or you shouldn't worship their gods, because they're very different. So this story about the patriarchs and that they are all related to each other is a really useful story sociologically, because it both creates connections within what's considered to be the tribes or the nation of Israel. It also creates boundaries that differentiates you from your neighbors that you're not supposed to interact with. So we think that is the best way to explain how this all came to be. Also, this explanation gives some hint as to when this text might have been written, because Abraham is the supreme patriarch. He's the first one. Everyone owes their being to Abraham. And Abraham is associated with the south, the area in Judah. So there are only two time periods in which Judah is really ascendant. One of them is during the reign of David and Solomon, who both are associated with the area around Jerusalem. So it would make sense that stories about Abraham would be written when someone from that same area was very powerful. Or after 722 BCE, when the northern Israel, so all of the tribes to the north of Judah, were conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and they were all carried off into exile. So after that time, without any Jewish people or Israelite people in northern Israel, Judah asserted its leadership over the entire area in that place of that vacuum. So in either of those two periods, it would make sense for this story to come about in which Abraham was the primary patriarch. And so that's interesting for us. What we think might have happened is that some stories existed as oral traditions before the temple and the court were located in Jerusalem. And then the stories were maybe first written down during the Davidic and Solomonic periods, and then continued to be worked on and arrived in their final written form sometime after 722. Another important thing to note is that the religion that's practiced during this period is actually really different than the religion that's practiced in the rest of the Bible. You'd expect that maybe the religion of Abraham, like we find in Father, would have established what religion was like for the rest of time, but it's actually not true at all. Remember that this is, according to the only internal story, a time before the law was given in Deuteronomy or anything from Moses, so they would have had a different set of rules to play by. So, for example, God is marked, or the experience of God is marked by a really strong personal relationship, and it isn't related to, or it isn't limited to a specific place. After Deuteronomy, after the law is given, we're told to worship God only in one place, and that's probably more of a political ploy to be able to concentrate money and power in one location, so that the priests associated with that one temple become much more powerful, and everyone has to come there and to be able to bring their offerings to encounter God. And so, lots of tourists essentially, but also it cements the prestige and power of just one location. That's after Deuteronomy. Before that, and in fact, what we see is that everywhere that Abraham or Isaac or Jacob experienced the divine, they set up an altar, they set up a pile of stones, and they worship God there. And they leave those stones behind. So there rise these altars all over this area in which locals gather to worship God in their own hometown. But that is a threat. That kind of diffuse ability to worship God is a threat to centralized authority. And so, of course, during the Deuteronomy period, when law is given and enforced, those altars are all destroyed to be able to consolidate power. Also, another marked difference in the religion is that, the name of God is not revealed as Yahweh until Exodus, until the law is given. So at this point in time, they're worshiping a God named El. We later learn that El and Yahweh are the same thing, but we don't know that yet. But what's interesting is that El is also the name of a local Canaanite god. So by Canaanite, we mean a foreign god, a god that they're not supposed to worship, because that would be idolatry. But in Genesis chapter 14, Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek, the high priest of El Elyon, who is the local deity in Salem. And so in doing so, by giving tribute to a foreign god, Abraham is giving credit, recognizing the power and the divinity of a local Canaanite cult. So that's interesting. You wouldn't think that that's allowed, but Genesis has no problem with that. There is no Baal worship, and there are no goddesses. So the kind of the conclusion we should draw is that at this point in time, there is some permeability between Canaanite worship and the worship of El, of the Hebrew, of the Israelite God. But there isn't really that strict difference between us and them in terms of the religious practices. Okay, so we're talking about the story of Jacob, and it's probably something that we're more familiar with. But it's important to note that younger siblings, Jacob is a younger sibling of Esau, have a really peculiar presence in the Hebrew scriptures. They're all over the place. David is a younger sibling. Solomon is a younger sibling. Isaac is a younger sibling of Ishmael. Jacob is a younger sibling. Joseph is a younger sibling. Samuel's a younger sibling. Moses is a younger sibling. So that kind of causes us to wonder, what is it? How do we make sense of that in light of the seeming preference for older sons to be the ones who are blessed, who receive more of an inheritance? Why are the younger sons so much more often ascendant? Well, there are several theories. Maybe it's a form of protest challenging the Israelite practice of sacrificing firstborns. So if you sacrifice your firstborn son, then of course it's going to be a younger son that becomes more important later on in the story. But actually reading other Near Eastern sources that are contemporaneous with the Hebrew scriptures, it shows that the practice of preference for firstborns was much more fluid, and that fathers were really free to give whatever blessing there might be to whichever son of their choice. So even the word for what we translate often as firstborn in the Bible, bekor, it's really ambiguous, and maybe it's better translated as chosen. So it's descriptive of the choice, but not necessarily, it doesn't proscriptive. It doesn't mean that the firstborn is necessarily chosen. So there was no system for automatic preference. So God was completely within God's norms to prefer, for example, the younger son's offering Abel to Cain's grain offering. And so this painting is the killing of Abel by Cain from early on in Genesis. And so Jacob could choose Ephraim over Manasseh, and David could pick Solomon over his older sons, and no one really had a problem with that. But why is it so common? So the fact that it was allowable, it does not answer the question about why it's common. Maybe one postulate, one answer. Looking at the Bible, we see a pattern in folk tales where the unexpected success of a younger sibling emphasizes the assistance of a superhuman force. So the young and the innocent, the underdog, is not expected to come out on top. It's not expected to rule, to be the hero. So because we don't expect it, we don't attribute their success, or we're less likely to attribute their success to their own merit, their own doing, because they're young, they're inexperienced. So that leaves more room for something else to be their aid, some other power, some other assistance. Moreover, when we actually look at several of these younger brothers, they're not just young and innocent, they're actually decidedly lacking in merit. They might be faulty in many ways. So it makes their ascendancy even more unexpected. For example, Moses, for example, is presented to us as someone who has already murdered before he's chosen to become a leader of the people. Or we could ask, did David deserve to be a king because of his skill with a slingshot? Those two things seem unrelated. So their eventual success is even more easily attributed to divine assistance because of the fact that they're younger. Collectively, it tells a story that the success of Israel's ancestors are not expected, and it emphasizes Israel's dependence on God. But that emphasizes that Israel's chosenness is acquired. It's not something that's an automatic privilege, like being a firstborn son. Israel's chosenness was not to be taken for granted. And there's room to see that Israel's theology of election, how they are selected, always leaves others dispossessed. So it's a zero-sum game. Israel's chosenness had to be paid for at someone else's expense. And I think that actually a lot more good could have been done if this was understood to be an assumption, and perhaps seen as a dangerous assumption. We'll get back to that more later on in this presentation. So let's go further on this. When early Christians were forced to explain how they could be God's chosen people, they compared themselves to Isaac. Interesting, right? The younger son, who displaced an entrenched but undeserving older brother, Ishmael. And so this is actually in the book of Galatians, or the epistle to the Galatians, chapter 4, 22 to 31. The church is being compared to Isaac. And those who had thought themselves as weak, or rather, let me be more specific, Jews who had thought themselves to be weak, but beloved as the children of God, in this had the tables turned on them, because they were now being seen as the older siblings, even though they had identified, the idea is being that Jacob's name in this story we're going to get to changes to Israel. And so Jacob's identity transfers to all of the nation of Israel. So seeing themselves as the younger child, actually now when there's a new younger kid on the block, they are no longer the younger child. So Christians turn their own identity against them. The deeper reality here is that dispossessed figures often cease to be so once God chooses them, and they instead oftentimes become a target for another character. Now, that's not something that's easy for people to accept, and oftentimes it's something that's ignored, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. So not surprisingly, in Romans chapter 9, verse 10 to 13, early Christians compared themselves to Jacob and compared Israel to Esau, Jacob's older brother, holding a status. Esau held a status that was neither appreciated because he gave up his birthright so willingly, or deserved because he was stupid enough to give up his birthright. So you see the irony in this, right? Because Jacob literally is Israel. But early Christians in the letter to the Romans were comparing Jacob to Esau and identifying Jacob directly with his older brother, as opposed, and then using the identity or reserving the identity of Jacob for themselves. So the church has retained the self-image of being an underdog. And that's even after the church achieved worldwide supremacy. And with it comes the resentment toward an older sibling when we always think of ourselves as the younger. And perhaps it's born out of insecurity felt towards older siblings. And that's oftentimes a bad place to be in, because our own insecurity doesn't allow us to see that, that there's actually power difference here, and that it doesn't allow us to question whether it's appropriate, which sibling actually has more power. Yes, in terms of chronology, Christianity arrives on the scene after Judaism does. But for most of the last 2,000 years, Christians have had a lot more power than from Jewish people. But continuing to view them as the older sibling can justify a lot of resentment and a lot of bad treatment. And that has been seen throughout the history, the problematic history of the ways that Christians have treated Jews, especially throughout most of the last 1,000 years. So one brief exception is Pope John the 23rd. He wrote that as an apology, we realize that the mark of Cain stands upon our foreheads. Across the centuries, our brother Abel has lain in the blood while we drew or shed the tears we caused by forgetting thy love. So this was an apology written in the 1960s, realizing that it was harmful to identify Christian power with being an underdog, because that didn't reflect the reality. But unfortunately, that didn't last very long, because when John Paul II takes his seat in Rome, he begins again to refer to Jews as our older brothers in the faith of Abraham. So a return back to the same problematic understanding. Okay, so let's all get on to the actual passage for today. I'm going to read this for us. That same night, he arose, he being Jacob, took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the wadi together with all that he had. But Jacob stayed back alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he was unable to overcome him, he touched his thigh joint so that Jacob's thigh joint was dislocated as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" He answered, "Jacob." He said, "You are no longer to be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." And Jacob asked him, "Now tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. And Jacob named the place Peniel, because he said, "I have seen God face to face and have survived." And the sun rose on him as he passed by Peniel, but he was limping because of his thigh. This is the reason why the sons of Israel, even to this day, do not eat the sinew of the nerve along the thigh joint, because he has touched the sinew of the nerve along Jacob's thigh joint. Okay, the translation probably doesn't match what's in your Bible. It's a translation by Klaus Westermann, good biblical scholar. So some notes. What does this happen in the story of Jacob's life? This happens right around that Jacob is about 97 years old. Jacob will die about 50 years later, according to the internal chronology of this text. Jacob is a younger twin. It's been alluded to. He comes out of, he's born grasping his brother's heel. That name identifies him as a usurper. He's a heel grasper, is literally his name. So he tricks his older brother out of his brother's birthright and blessing, and then almost immediately has to flee. He lives for a number of years with his uncle, who becomes his father-in-law, marries 2 of his cousins, tricks his father-in-law as well, and it realizes that he must make peace with this older brother who, was deeply hurt and enraged that his younger brother stole his birthright. So as he's making his journey back to reconcile with his older brother Esau, that's when this occurs. So it's in the middle of a journey. He's on his way to meet Esau. And Jacob, being the trickster that he is, being kind of the one who always is out there to save his own skin first, sends his wives and children ahead of him, divides the camp so that, even if they don't survive, he will, essentially. So they're going to bear the first brunt of the attack because he's expecting an attack from his brother Esau and his entire tribe, his large family of warriors. So this is not going to go well for him, he expects, and he is very afraid. He's prayed to God for help a few chapters before, and God has appeared to him in vision. And that's the vision about that we sometimes call Jacob's ladder of divine beings rising and to heaven and coming down to earth. This text is complicated in the way when we actually look at it as just literature. It is clearly a text that has been modified over time. It was mainly written by the Yahwist, the J author, and there are some parts that are original and some parts that have clearly been added. Some notes about words here. Verse 24, ish. When the text in English says man, what we are oftentimes tempted to think of as being an angel or divine being, the text uses the word for not just a human, that would be Adam, but a human male, ish. So really, man is a great translation there. And it expresses Jacob's experience of this other being. Jacob recognizes the attacker as being roughly human and having roughly male form. Doesn't know very much else about him, but if he had to use a word, using the experience of his eyes, he would have said that was a man, a dude. Verse 28, the verb for struggle with God, struggle there is shera. It's really only used here in the entire Bible. It doesn't show up anywhere else. Meaning is highly uncertain as a result, which is funny because it seems like a really important word in this whole text to be able to understand what exactly happened. Some ways to translate it, God contests, maybe, rule might be another one. But the reason it shows up is because it shows a strong linguistic similarity to Israel. So Shera, same consonants in the word Israel. But what Israel means is sort of ambiguous, because if you look at it actually in terms of its grammar, it literally means may God contest or may God rule. God is the subject here of the verb rule. But the way it's interpreted here in this story, it means that Jacob has contested with God. So God is turned into the object. So God has moved from subject of the verb to the object of the verb. And that's a big difference, especially when it comes to God, when we move God out of the position of the one contesting to the one being contested with. So there's a lot of room for interpretation. Still sticking to verse 28, it's important to note that verse 28 is basically repeated again a few chapters later in chapter 35, verse 10. It's almost a word for word copy. So we're not quite sure which one was written first and then which one was the copy. It's possible it was written in chapter 35, verse 10 first and then copied into the story, or the other way around. Also, in verse 28, when the phrase, you have struggled with God and with men, these two opposite things, nothing is both God and man at this point in time. So God and man is a way to express totality. So it's a idiom to say you have struggled with everything. You've struggled with God and men, and that is everything. It's sort of like the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When you have two polar opposites together, you're expressing that this is the tree of knowledge of everything, because everything is either good or evil at this point in time. Another note, in verse 29, if we go on, continue on, the word to bless, barak, here it means a transfer of strength. So it's literally some of the strength of this being transferred to Jacob. That's the form of blessing. And it's the only place in the text anywhere where blessing is won by struggle and blessing is not given. So we could say that the blessing that happens here is an allusion to the blessing that Jacob receives from his father Isaac, or the blessing from God, but it's not an equivalent because there's this one big difference that it's won by struggle. Also, the refusal in verse 29 for this adversary to give the adversary's name. It parallels a chapter or a verse in the book of Judges, Judges 13:18. But in that section, it's very clear that the being that's refusing to name itself is an angel of God. That's what is called in the text. Here, the word is man. So if there's another refusal and it's clear that it's the angel of God, it's a suggestion that maybe here this is not an angel of God, because by parallel, if it was, the angel of God would have been named as such here. Okay, some other observations. It seems important that Jacob's alone for the story. It implies that this is the type of struggle that one can engage with only when one is alone. There's no helper, there's no rescue. But this isn't a struggle. It's something more like an attack by a robber or a murderer, an attack on someone who is vulnerable and alone, and it's designed to be easy to win. It's not a fair match of skill in which both parties have consented and are prepared. Let's talk about who this attacker is. If the attacker is God or an angel, it's hard to explain why the attacker is nearly bested by a human being, no matter how strong Jacob was. Remember, Jacob is 97 at this point. We might also ask why God or an angel is afraid of the sunrise. God is not a vampire, and whether God needs the advantage of a defenseless surprise Jacob to be victorious. There is a distinct animistic tone that can't be separated from the place where this happens. So let's pay attention to the setting of this. It's a ford, a river. The Jabbok is a historic or is a geographic place. We could go and visit it today. It's a very narrow river at the bottom of a gorge. It's dangerous. The danger is personified in the attacker who does not want the traveler to cross. It's sort of like the motif behind a bridge troll. Nowhere else is it implied that God or Yahweh had a fear of daybreak and is only active at night, like a robber. So it's unlikely, or we're starting to question whether this really is God. And also note that the attacker must hide their identity and they don't reveal their name. Names at this point in time, this culture, reveal a person's character. So when Jacob tells the man that he's a usurper, he's a heel grabber when he tells him his name, this is a big mistake because it gives the other person the ability to command, to curse, or to conjure Jacob. That's probably part of the reason that if this is some type of non-human being, that they don't want to give their name, because that would give Jacob the power to summon, conjure, bless, or curse them as well. In fact, there's a parallel story in Exodus chapter 4, verse 24, when God does attack travelers in the middle of the night. But God isn't embarrassed to identify God's self by name. God declares that this is God doing this. So it does seem odd here that God is reluctant to identify God's self, if it is in fact God here. In fact, this doesn't really seem to bear a resemblance to the religion of Israel or the patriarchs at all. And if you look at the wordplay in the name where this happens, in Hebrew, it's Yabok Abok, for the ford of Jabbok. And it shows a local familiarity with this place. No one else would have that type of sing-song familiarity. Jacob doesn't seem to believe that he's struggling with God, that he called on for help earlier in verse 11. And it doesn't seem that the J author was trying to identify the attacker with God. So this is not a test. This is not an answer to Jacob's prayer to El for rescue from his brother Esau. The answer to that prayer is the rescue itself that happens later on. So the features of this, the surprise attack, the fear of day, and the hidden identity of the deity all point to a rather ominous presence. And it's absolutely consistent with other descriptions from this time period and the surrounding cultures of nature demons. There are many attempts by biblical scholars to explain this. Many offer possibilities. They say, maybe it's a demon, a river demon, maybe it's God, or maybe it's an angel. One particular commenter in particular, who's a really great scholar, Klaus Westermann, takes a firm position that this is a demon. This is like a spirit, a water spirit of the ford personified. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a text that has a reception history that is not now in its original form. So let's think about what might be original. One criteria is which parts form a self-contained narrative, which parts make sense on their own. And what parts acknowledge or seem to be contingent on things that happen after the story. So the knowledge of the existence of Israel. So, for example, there's almost universal certainty amongst all biblical scholars that verses 32 and the second half of verse 25 are later additions, because they seem to acknowledge that they seem to all be designed around explaining a later practice for the people of Israel of not eating a piece of part of meat. So that's later. That comes in later. So we go from the universal certainty to large numbers of scholars agree that verses 27 and 28 are also later additions, because they also presuppose the existence of Israel. So they're probably written at a time when Israel already existed. Remember, according to the internal chronology of this, Israel does not yet exist as a nation because Jacob's 12 sons haven't given rise to the 12 tribes. And also naming Jacob as Israel, as giving Jacob the same name as the later nation, presupposes the establishment of the people that already call themselves Israel, so that it's meaningful. So really only after Jacob had become the forefather of Israel was his name changed to Israel. And it makes him a representative of Israel. That makes sense much later. So 27 and 28 also likely not original. The least certain, but still with quite a few scholars, trusted scholars, thinking that it's a later addition, would be the second half of verse 30. Because it doesn't seem to fit well with the preceding narrative. So when we take that out, we have a story, and let's see if it makes sense. That same night he arose, took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the wadi together with all that he had, but Jacob stayed back alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he was unable to overcome him, he touched his thigh. Then Jacob said, let me go. Then the man said, let me go. Dawn is breaking. But he answered, I will not let you go until you bless me. And Jacob asked him, now tell me your name. But he said, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob named the place. And the sun rose on him as he passed by Penuel, but he was limping because of his thigh. So that is actually a complete story. And the question is, we know that there's meaning that we've attributed to this story with the additions, but the original story had significance as well. What is the meaning of the original story? And that adds greater complexity to our understanding of the text as a whole, both its starting point as well as its ending point. I think it's interesting to note the setting again, that this codes the name of a place. So not just the ford of Jabbok, but a place name is given. So that is part of the reason that this story seems to exist. It explains why something came to be named the way it is. Also note that in this original form, it is ambiguous who the winner is. We don't really know, because it seems like Jacob is actually quite weak by the end of this and really doesn't need to, or is no longer able to overcome his adversary because of his withered hip. It's also interesting to note that most of the sermons that are probably preached on this derive their meaning from the additions, not the original story. A lot is said about the meaning of the name Israel, or the dislocation of the thigh joint, but those are later additions. So let's try to tell a story about what the original meaning of the narrative is, because we shouldn't assume that the narrative only gains its meaning from the later additions. So it is a story inserted along a larger narrative, larger story of a journey. Jacob's on his way to meet his brother Esau. It's neither Yahweh or God or the God of Isaac that attacks him. It's probably a river demon that wants to stop him from crossing. So the point of this original story is that it's consistent with all the other encounters that Jacob has had. There's a lethal danger to the attack of a river demon. Jacob survives. He's limping and he carries from it power, what the text calls a blessing from his superhuman opponent. And as the sun rises on him, he has experienced that God was with him, helping him to survive the attack. So now he has the confidence that he can face Esau as well, that God is on his side, no matter what attack is coming his way. So we're not denying, by taking God out of the identity of this adversary, we're not saying that God isn't a part of the story, but we're saying that God can actually be on Jacob's side. God is not Jacob's adversary. And for me, theologically, that feels like it makes a lot more sense, because I don't understand why God would be the one wrestling against me. God is told to be on our side. God is never our adversary. In fact, this rendering of this original story makes it more clear that there are forces out there, things that oppose us, but God is the thing that supports us, that gives us the strength. And I like that. I like that interpretation a bit more. Okay, so let's talk about Jacob the trickster and what this means for Jacob's evolution as a person. This is part of a larger story of Jacob growing up. It's a life history about how he learns about himself and about other people through his experience of him. It's a story about a younger brother who comes to inherit, about an exile who outwits his master, someone who thinks of themselves as marginal, an underdog who later comes on to really inherit everything, right? Because he is Israel by the end of the story. Let's remember that also deception is not a uniquely Jacobian trait. Both Abraham and Isaac also lie about their identity of their wives, and they pass them off as their sisters, but it is mostly associated with Jacob. Jacob, throughout his life, breaks rules and gets away with it. That's what gives him the identity as being a trickster. Remember, his name means that he's a usurper. His name literally identifies him as a heel grabber. That means that as he was pulled out of the womb, he was still grabbing onto his brother's heel. The rest of the Bible expects obedience to rules, but this story doesn't. This story of Jacob, whether it be deceiving his brother, deceiving his uncle, provides some relief, some vicarious pleasure. It isn't a recommendation to go and do likewise, though. It's somewhat cathartic. We might smile at his success, but it's still troubling that the origin of Israel got its blessing by deceit, because patriarchs are a way that we talk about our ideals as a people, and we use the personification of these ideals in legendary characters. We still have them today. We call them forefathers. So, we tell stories about our national identity or our value as being, upright and honest. And we tell the story about Washington and a cherry tree, and that he could not tell a lie, as being resonant for us as a nation because we value in ourselves that we're honest. So Jacob's really the opposite of that. Jacob suffers the consequences of deception. That happens in his life as well, but he never seems to really learn from it. So much so that Hosea and Jeremiah both are very concerned about the story of Jacob and speak against it. Hosea does it, I think, 4 times, and warns people not to be like Jacob. Jeremiah goes on to say, never trust a brother, for every brother cheats. And you could say, well, that seems like a stretch that Jeremiah is referring to Jacob. But in the Hebrew, that phrase, never trust a brother, for every brother cheats, is pronounced Akob Yaakov. So the name of Jacob is in that phrase itself. So it's very clear that Jeremiah is warning us not to be like Jacob. But remember that Jacob is never censored in Genesis. He never loses his blessing in Genesis. In fact, Genesis is pretty ambiguous about Jacob, never really condemning him at all. And the problem is that a trickster like Jacob seems to have no respect for authority. He's flouted the authority of his brother, his father, his maternal uncle, his father-in-law, and the authority of God. After God appears to him in verse 28:12, for example, when God makes this appearance and in all of God's splendor and the ladder to heaven appears, Jacob's response is to pledge allegiance to God with conditions, to say, I will put all of my trust in you as long as you continue to feed and clothe me first. So Jacob always has this approach that wanting to get something out of a relationship. But maybe our greater discomfort is not with Jacob, but with what Jacob reveals about God, that in the contest between fools and the cunning, God takes the side of people who are cunning. It's another example of God writing straight with crooked lines. But if this text recognizes the moral ambiguity of Israel, and I'm talking about Israel, the character here, it also can be extrapolated to say something about the idea that holiness of the people, the nation of Israel, is an ideal, but it isn't often realized. Instead, the Bible actually seems to doubt Israel's own merit. And in fact, the rest of the text throughout the rest of the Hebrew scriptures repeatedly document Israel's disobedience to God. And so these tales are central to the identity and the self-image of Israel, and it's not always in a good way. So I said, let's talk about, I reminded us about the setting. The setting is the crossing of a river, and it's a good metaphor. It's an opportunity for Jacob to cross over from his identity as a usurper to his better self. It's the turning point here for Jacob because this is the first time that Jacob's actually struggling directly with no disguise, no deception, no trickery, but he's actually directly confronting his problems. And so this new name is linked with survival and closeness to God, along with wrestling and prevailing. But to be honest, don't think that, I should let you know that don't think that this means that Jacob was reformed completely. Because after the story, he goes and he reconciles with Esau, and Esau and he begin a journey, arm in arm, just as friends again, back to Esau's home. Except Jacob tells Esau, the children in my group, they're really frail. My animals are weak and we're very slow. So why don't you go on ahead and we'll catch up to you. We'll meet you at your house. Esau goes on and continues on home. Jacob immediately turns around and goes in the other direction. So Jacob retains his identity. He is a trickster, a struggler, a prevailer, and he is Israel. But remember how the frequent use of the successful younger sibling, that long list of successful younger siblings in the Hebrew Testament, leaves others dispossessed. Jacob inherits at the expense of Esau. Reuben loses favor with Jacob to make room for Joseph. The problem with founding fathers, people in whose person is carried the identity of a nation, of a people, the problem when they are younger siblings or underdogs is that there's a temptation to believe that life is a zero-sum game, that someone has to lose in order for you to be successful, and that there's a temptation to accept that that's just the way things are. I think our Christian faith teaches us something very different, that in Christ's abundance, there is enough for all, as long as we aren't greedy, and as long as we aren't focused on our own benefit. And that, if anything, was Jacob's primary problem. He repeatedly focused on his own benefit and doesn't seem to care about the consequences for anyone else. So it does matter who our heroes are, who our patriarchs are, because the danger is that when the historical Israel of the Bible bases their identity on a character as flawed as Jacob, they might be vulnerable to also adopt and normalize his character flaws. Jacob repeatedly sees himself as vulnerable, younger, overlooked, or having gotten the short end of the stick. And that underdog mentality justifies any ploy or trick that he can think of to get more for himself because life has been so unfair to him. If we learn from the sins of the Christian church as it rose from persecuted fringe to global oppressive empire, we see that the danger with identifying with an underdog who always feels self-justified in his attempts to get his fair share is that this is the sort of person or nation that probably won't be able to recognize when they are no longer an underdog, but when they have made it, when it's time to start acknowledging the responsibility of their blessing instead of being obsessed with their insecurity. Okay, so where am I going with all this? We're going to talk about some real present-day consequences of Jacob, and we're going to talk about that in the context of the modern state of Israel. This is a state that takes its name from a biblical people and also in turn from the character of Jacob. The story of the nation of Israel is no doubt born out of extreme disadvantage and tragedy, a people scattered in diaspora throughout Europe and the world, who suffered multiple genocidal campaigns. I should also note and say that nothing that I'm saying here is meant to imply that all Jewish people, all citizens of Israel believe or think one thing. In fact, there is a vibrant minority of Jewish Israeli citizens who are absolutely opposed to the occupation of Palestine. But as a whole, as a majority, this is what has happened as a result of the current government structure and the majority of Jewish Israeli citizens. So it seems pretty fair to say that Israel of 70 years ago might have identified with a younger sibling that was justified in using any available trick to even the playing field. But this identity as an underdog doesn't really feel appropriate anymore. And the need for more, the assumption that the unfairness dealt to Israel justifies the miseries of the Palestinian people, is no longer true, because for Israel to win, someone else has got to lose. That's just not true either. And it's resulted in what we now call the occupation of Palestine. It might seem odd for a church Bible study to wade into the murky waters of geopolitics, but this is fundamentally an issue of faith. And it's an appropriate place for the church to stand as a witness against what is wrong, what is dehumanizing, what is sinful. And this is because scripture is so often used as the justification for the treatment of Palestinians, the stealing of land, the annexation of Jerusalem. So it's our responsibility as people who claim to revere these scriptures to educate ourselves and to speak out that Holy Scripture is never to be used to justify the oppression of any people group. So let's take some time to get educated. That's going to be the rest of this Bible study. So first step, look at the history of Israel's occupation of Palestine to see if the modern nation state of Israel speaks truth when it claims that it is fighting for its survival, even in the present day, and is therefore justified in its use of excessive violence and the denial of equal human rights to Palestinians, who are viewed as an existential threat to Israel's Jewish identity. I hope by the end of this that you will feel empowered by the facts of the situation to participate in any discussion about how our Christian faith directly contradicts the attempt by both Christians and some Jews to improperly use scripture, including the character of Jacob, to occupy and terrorize Palestinians. So, brief history. 1882, the first Jewish settlement at Rishon LeZion. This is under Ottoman Turkish rule. 1918, at the end of World War I, Palestine becomes a mandate of Britain. So it is a protectorate that's overseen by British government. The mandate ends in 1947, and the UN General Assembly decides on a partition of Palestine to a Jewish and Arab state within with Jerusalem as an international city. The Arab nations don't agree, and war breaks out. So in 1948, Jewish armies defeat Arab armies. Jordan claims the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount. Egyptians occupy Gaza and the Sinai. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announces the birth of Israel. Within minutes, President Truman recognizes the new state of Israel, and Palestinians experience the Nakba, which is the dispossession, the uprooting, the killing, the being expelled of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, with hundreds of Palestinian villages being razed, not just razed, but erased off the map. Literally, maps were changed overnight that erased the existence of Palestinian villages. In 1949, an armistice agreement is signed that establishes the demarcation line between the armies of Israel and those of its neighbors. This is the green line that's referred to later. In 1967, the 6 Days War occurs, and that is a conflict that begins with President Nasser of Egypt blockading the Straits of Tiran, which gives Israel a cause to go to war, and a surprise attack by Israel that acquires control of the Sinai, the Golden Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. So this is when Israel begins to occupy Palestinian territory. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee or are expelled from their homes. Israel's military strengthens or the pro-Israeli orientation of the United States policy. So Israel's success really gains an ally from the US. But also more importantly, this is when Israel begins moving Israeli citizens, Jewish Israeli citizens, into housing enclaves called settlements on Palestinian land that it had begun to occupy during the 1967 war. The 1973 Yom Kippur War is fought between Egypt and Syria against Israel. And the goal is to regain their lands that are occupied. When Israel seems to be losing the battle, the US steps in and resupplies Israel with arms. Israel is ultimately successful. During this period, there's extreme oppression of Palestinians living in the occupied territories, what now become the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza. And in 1987, the first Intifada begins. It's an uprising of Palestinians. It is triggered by a traffic accident in which an Israeli Defense Force truck collides with a civilian car, killing 4 Palestinians. The protests that occur as a result involve unarmed resistance and civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, economic boycotts, refusals to drive taxis, refusals to drive with Israeli licenses, refusal to pay taxes, graffiti, barricading throwing stones and Molotov cocktails. But these instances of stone throwing and Molotov cocktail throwing are limited and directed at the Israeli Defense Force and the infrastructure of Israel that is within the Palestinian territory. So the violence does not spill onto the territory belonging to the state of Israel. But in response to stone throwing and Molotov cocktails, Israel deploys 80,000 soldiers that fire live rounds at Palestinian citizens and civilians. In the first 13 months, 332 Palestinians are killed, as opposed to 12 Israelis. Given the high proportion of children killed, Israel adopts a policy of might, power, and beatings, namely breaking Palestinian bones. The global outrage at the images of children being beaten with clubs leads to the adoption of semi-lethal plastic bullets instead of live rounds. In '93, the Oslo Accords are signed, or rather are initiated, and they're signed in '95. The Accord spells out a declaration of principles that created the Palestinian Authority to administer Palestinian land. But Palestinian land, what's defined as Palestinian land, is already at this point surrounded by Israeli settlements or Israeli military installations. So it's just a series of islands, not a contiguous territory. Israel continues to take Palestinian land to build Jewish-only bypass roads and colonies, and to fragment the West Bank into isolated pockets of Palestinian life that are separated by Jewish settlements. At Camp David in 2000, the Prime Minister of Israel and Arafat meet with Clinton, and Arafat is presented with a take it or leave it deal that is purported to offer the promise of an independent, demilitarized Palestinian state. But the reality is that Israel demands continued control of Palestinian airspace, West Bank water aquifers, prolonged lease of land along the border with Jordan, the annexation of land under Jewish settlements, and sovereignty over most of Jerusalem and the bypass roads in the West Bank. So Arafat refuses this deal, which was now referred to as Israel's most generous offer. It's not a coincidence that the Second Intifada begins also in 2000. It's the second Palestinian uprising. It lasts for 5 years. It begins with a religious offense by the Israeli Prime Minister when Ariel Sharon visits the Temple Mount, the second holiest site in all of Islam. The death toll, including military and civilians, is estimated to be 3,000 Palestinians, 1,000 Israelis. In 2002, the Israeli parliament decides to build a wall, a separation barrier that does not conform to the Green Line, but that isolates Israeli colonies and further fragments Palestinian land. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in 2004 rules that the route of Israel's separation barrier violates international law. As recently as 2014, in Operation Protective Edge, it's an Israeli military operation launched in Gaza Strip, leaves 2,300 Palestinian civilians killed, 10,600 wounded, 66 Israeli soldiers are killed, and 469 wounded. In 2016, the US approves a military package worth $38 billion over the next 10 years for Israel. It's the largest deal in US history. Later that year, Gazans begin their weekly Great March Return demonstrations at the boundary with Israel. And at the end of the year of 2016, 250 Palestinians have been killed and over 20,000 injured. Many survivors have lost their limbs after being shot by Israeli soldiers. Human rights organizations condemned Israel's shoot to kill or maim policy. In 2018, the Israeli Knesset adopts the nation-state law, which specifies that the state of Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish people only. So what does this look like in terms of maps? So we see from 1917, when the British Mandate is given, or Palestine, to the present day, what has been the land loss of Palestinian land. Since 1967, this has been exacerbated by the presence of Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian territories. At this point, it's 94,000 structures have been built on illegally taken land. There's also a two-tiered legal system. Jewish settlers are under Israeli common law, but Palestinians are under military law. That means that Palestinian children who are detained or arrested in the territories are under military arrest and prosecution. Israel is the only country in the world that systemically brings children before military courts. So all of this I say to start to give us the information to then evaluate the statements that were given by the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, 2 weeks ago before Congress. Is Israel a democratic state that respects the rights of all citizens? Does Israel conform to international law? Is Israel justified in its use of violence when the numbers are so lopsided in the consequences? A small number of deaths on the Israeli side in conflict, large numbers of deaths on the Palestinian side. So is Israel truly fighting for its survival, or is it behaving like a very powerful occupying force? So what President Isaac Herzog said: when the state of Israel was established in 1948, the land which the Almighty promised to Abraham, to which Moses led the Israelites, the land of the Bible of milk and honey, evolved into an exquisite land of democracy. Against all odds, the Jewish people returned home and built a national home which became a beautiful Israeli democracy, a mosaic of Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, and Circassians, secular, traditional, and Orthodox of all denominations, and all possible views and lifestyles, a land which welcomed an ingathering of exiles from 100 different countries. A country which takes pride in its vibrant democracy, its protection of minorities, human rights, and civil liberties, as laid down by its parliament, the Knesset, and safeguarded by its strong Supreme Court and independent judiciary. A state founded on complete equality of social and political rights for all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or gender, as stipulated explicitly in Israel's Declaration of Independence. So, this is the Israeli self-view or self-conception, and it seems to be highly at odds with the reality that rights are not respected. And so it leads us to ask the question, is Israel justified in its identity as someone who requires the justification of winning at any means? President Herzog went on to say that Palestinian terror against Israel or Israelis undermines any possibility for a future peace between our peoples. Israelis are targeted while waiting for buses, while taking a stroll on the promenade, while spending time with their family. At the same time, successful terror attacks are celebrated, terrorists are glorified, and their families are financially rewarded for every Israeli they attack. This is inconceivable. It's a moral disgrace. So President Herzog talks about or is able to see Palestinians as being an aggressor and constructs them as being kind of a really, really serious problem, and contrasts that with his own society, which he sees as being peaceful, as being respective of civil rights and democracy. And so this is why Congressperson Jayapal, Congressperson from Washington, earlier this month or last month in July, was condemned for calling Israel a racist state because it does not conform to Israel's self-perception of its identity. So let's talk about that. In the past 70 years, there have been 120,000 home demolitions by Israel of Palestinian homes. That has left 6.4 million Palestinian refugees, 5.6 million of whom are registered with the UN Relief and Works Agency. There have been 1,679 Israelis killed as a result of conflict and violence. And of course, the loss of each of their lives is a tragedy. In the same period, 11,284 Palestinians have been killed, 2014 being the deadliest year on record. The Israeli justice system has a nearly 100% conviction rate for Palestinians. Since 1967, 800,000 Palestinians have been detained. And as of January 1st, 2019, there were 6,069 Palestinians currently in Israeli detention, of which 232 were children in military detention and 494 were being detained without any charges. The per capita income for a Jewish Israeli is $37,270. In the West Bank for a Palestinian, it's $4,978. So that's like less than 1/7. In Gaza, for a Palestinian, it's $1,948 a year annually. Israel controls Palestine's land borders, international trade, ability to collect taxes, natural resources, including Israeli-only highways built to reach the settlements, and a border wall that isolates Palestinian communities, all in the name of protection. In a land where access to water is crucial for food production and daily survival, Israeli settlers on Palestinian land are allocated 369 liters of potable water a day. Palestinians living in the West Bank are allocated 73 liters of potable water, and Palestinians in Gaza, where despite coastline on the Mediterranean Sea, Israel blocks access to desalination plants, so they're only given 90 liters of water, of which only 10 are drinkable. By the way, the World Health Organization considers 100 liters per day to be the daily recommended minimum for survival. In 2018, the nation-state basic law was passed, and it functions as a constitutional amendment in Israel. Israel has no actual constitution, so basic laws form the foundation for policy. It codified discrimination against Arab Israeli citizens as part of national policy. It declared that the right to self-determination is a right reserved only for Jewish citizens of Israel, despite 1.5 million, or about 20% of Israeli citizens being Christian or Muslim Arabs. So the statement that Israel is a threatened country that loves human rights and democracy and cherishes and protects its minorities, and that Palestinians are terrorists that threaten the existence of Israel, doesn't conform to actual reality, in which Israelis are more wealthy, have better access to clean water, are able to determine their own national destiny, in which they are able to be detained under civilian and not military law, in which they have a far disproportionate death rate as a result of violence. It's a 5-to-1 ratio. This doesn't really conform to reality, this identity that President Herzog spoke about. So though, back to the question of why are we talking about this in a Bible study? It's because the danger of glorifying the trickster, of always thinking of oneself as an underdog, of thinking that we are the people that wrestled with an angel and overcame unknowable odds, that we struggle, is not always reflected in reality, the current reality of power, that Israel has both wealth and power in excess, but because it continues to see itself as being the younger brother, as being the one that got the short end of the stick, and therefore the one that is always fighting for survival, justifies massive human rights abuses at the hands of Palestinians, as well as the assumption that for Israel to prevail, to come out on top, someone else must lose. Remember, again, reminding you of the Christian idea that, in fact, in this world, there is enough for all, and that in God's abundance, that all have a place and all can thrive. So I want to tell you about what the United Church of Christ has done about this, and whether assure you that being able to criticize Israel's actions towards Palestinians is not in some way some fringe belief in the United Church of Christ. In fact, it's firmly a central part of our beliefs as a denomination. There have been 34 biannual meetings since 1967. We call them general synods, in which delegates from all over the denomination gather in a city to pass resolutions that determine our policies as a church. In 20 of those 34 general synods, resolutions of witness have been passed pleading for justice in Palestine. They have consistently condemned violence and condemned anti-Semitism. So they condemn violence, but they also affirm the right of Israel to exist, and condemn violence against Jewish people. The resolutions historically emphasized more of a political solution, but more recently they focus on being critical of human rights abuses and condemn the theological claims that underpin and justify Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands. So some highlights. In 1973, the General Synod voted on a resolution that declared that the United Church of Christ supported a two-state solution, the right to exist of both is the state of Israel as well as an independent country for Palestinian Arabs. In 2003, the United Church of Christ approved a resolution that condemned Christian Zionism, the assumption by some Christians that the Bible authorizes and instructs Jews to return to the Holy Land as a historical birthright. The phrase that at the founding of the State of Israel, that Israel was to be a land without a people for a people without a land is simply not true, because at that point, the land that would become Israel was fully occupied by Palestinians. To think of it as an empty land is what led to the dispossession of land by the people that were already living there. In the same way that early missionaries came to Hawaii and thought that it was land to be possessed, when it was already its own brilliant, thriving culture, needed nothing else from the mainland. In 2005, the United Church of Christ asked its leadership to advocate for a political process that would reduce our military support of Israel. Going back to that, we give Israel more money than all of the rest of our foreign military aid to other countries put together. That is not true currently because of the war in Ukraine. So far, we have pledged $46.6 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since 2022. But that has to be seen in context that we have also given $150 billion worth of military aid to Israel. And most of this military aid is then directed through weapons against Palestinians. So we are complicit as a nation. And that is our responsibility as citizens of the United States to advocate for our representatives to be responsible about how they're spending our tax dollars. But we don't only provide aid. The United States also uses its veto power in the UN to protect Israel. In its history, the United States has used its veto power 81 times, 44 of those times to protect Israel from resolutions that would be critical of its human rights abuses. For the record, the other 4 permanent members of the Security Council have used their veto a total of 83 times collectively. So nearly half of the vetoes in the Security Council have been by the United States, and about a quarter of the total vetoes in the history of the United Nations have been used to protect Israel from criticism of its human rights abuses. To date, Israel has never been condemned by the Security Council, even though it is second only to South Africa under apartheid in terms of the number of proposed condemnations it's faced. In 2015, the United Church of Christ affirmed a resolution that advocated for a policy of boycott, divestment, sanctions, which means that the United Church of Christ would no longer, through its pension board and its investment arm, profit from the illegal occupation of Palestinian land. So businesses that were operating on stolen land would not be eligible for our investments. And so to use our financial leverage. In 2021, a resolution was approved that did 2 important things. It named theologically that the treatment of Palestinians by Israel is a sin, incompatible with our understanding of the message of the gospel and the prophets. It also denied that the occupation of Palestine is a purely political problem outside of the concern of the church, or that the oppression of Palestinians is simply an inevitable consequence of geopolitical powers. It also rejects laws that privilege one race or religion over another, and the resolution finally specifically named that the legal apparatus in Operation Israel that renders Palestinians second-class citizens is a form of apartheid, consistent with the international definitions, legal definitions of that word. So the United Church of Christ has been consistent in our witness, and so that gives us kind of encouragement as a church to ask how we can be a part of the solution and how our theology convicts us to act as a result of what we know is happening, the oppression, the stealing of land, the treating of people, human beings, as second-class citizens. So some questions for us to consider. In light of all of this, in light of what we've learned about how a story can become a nation, can become an ideology, can become a justification, can become violence. The question is, how do we identify with an underdog as a means to avoid the responsibilities of our own power? What are the obligations of an identity to be constantly in contest with God. What does it mean to contest with God, to struggle with God? How do we selectively lionize our heroes and ignore the parts of them that probably should be corrected? And is holiness an identity or a calling? I should add one more to this, a question that is raised by a trusted mentor and good friend of mine, Charlie Pillsbury. He will ask about the nation state of Israel today. Has Israel contested with God? Have they actually deserved the name Israel, which is to struggle with the obligations of being holy? But it isn't only Israel. How do we ourselves, take up the mantle to struggle with the obligations of being holy? Or do we see that holiness is simply a birthright that we deserve? I think these are the questions that this passage brings up, and hope that we will see you in church on Sunday.